Hi everybody, welcome to our section 2 of the course where we're going to talk about how we actually perform a vulnerability assessment. So we're going to start with, preparing for the assessment. So what kind of things you need to do to properly scope your assessment, and then get into actually creating like an inventory list of assets called an asset inventory, which identifies all of the components of your system or organization, whether that's software or hardware. You're going to create this exhaustive list that includes, descriptions, maybe existing security measures, what you plan to do within the assessment for that specific component. And you can even get into things like, listing the vulnerabilities that you're looking out for or that you should consider with this type of asset. Let's say an EC2 instance within AWS. What type of vulnerabilities should you have to worry about for this? And so it's really a guide for your assessment, but as well, it's creating everything you need to know about what you're actually going to be testing. And so from this, then you can take that information, start using your scanning tools. So we'll, in this course or the section of this course, get into the common tools that you will use to properly scan these various assets, and then also going to walk through actual demonstration of a couple of these tools to give you some real hands-on experience, and then we're going to end with actually interpreting the results from your assessments, whether that's results from the scanning tools or things you do manually, but ultimately it's putting it all together into a nice report that's easy to understand and digest for a wide variety of audiences. And next video we're actually just going to start with the prep. So how do we actually scope and define our assessment? Looking forward to it. Thanks. Bye. Hey everybody, welcome to our section 2 of the course, where we're going to talk about how do we actually perform an assessment. So up to this point, you should really understand the basics of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and now we're actually going to get into how do we perform an assessment to be able to identify and classify some of those vulnerabilities that might be present in your system before we get into actual penetration testing. So this video is focused on how do we actually prepare for this assessment. So what are the things I need to do as the security professional to be able to make a successful assessment. And then as well, I'm going to kind of do an overview of the common tools that we use at this phase of the VAPT process. So let's dive in. So, what are the things that really matter for having a successful assessment? I mentioned before, scoping and defining and planning are super important. So, defining what are you actually evaluating, and this is going to involve an asset inventory, which we'll get to in a separate video. But really, it's about defining, what are the assets that you're trying to protect against, what are their existing security measures, and what are your real targets for testing. Assigning a specific tool to assess a specific asset. This is where you kind of create that map. Next, you're going to gather your actual documentation, right? Your network diagrams or infrastructure, your system architecture documents, software inventories, all the dependencies that you're using, and what you're really trying to do is understand your environment. So all the different pieces that kind of come together to create your system or organization, depending on what you're actually testing. But ultimately, what makes us really successful is setting clear objectives. Are you targeting compliance or certifications, or is it just a security improvement, right? That'll kind of depend on, the level of testing that you might do, what you're actually testing for, and then defining kind of the priority levels, right? Depending on what certification you might be trying to target, you kind of might bump up specific vulnerabilities because that has to be included in your certification process. And a really important thing to remember is, again, management buy-in. So once you create all of these objectives, then you actually need to go and it's important to physically get this signed, right? Because in terms of liability, what you're going to be do, it's important for you, it's important for your company to actually understand the resources that are being dedicated to this project. And so, getting that management sign off on what you're going to be doing is important, and then creating the boundaries for scope and time, and wrapping all that up before you actually start the assessment. So really it's all about being focused and efficient to make this successful and stop it from being endless and a drain on resources. So you're kind of doing, a constant cost benefit analysis as you're going through this to make sure it's successful. Now, before we actually get into the assessment, I want to discuss some of the tools. This is part of the preparation, selecting the proper tools for the job. And so here's an overview of the common tools that you might see that security professionals might use during an assessment. And each one kind of caters to different things that you're trying to actually test for, whether that's the network or software, front-facing applications or the back end. So, always a great place to start when you're dealing with anything that's internet connected is Nmap. So it's like a great, versatile tool. It's going to, help you discover networks that you're using and do kind of a security audit of your network. So it really excels in kind of mapping your network infrastructure, identifying open ports, and detecting services that are running on network devices. And I know this is maybe a bit more on the penetration side, but I think it's pretty useful in kind of creating that kind of map of your system, right? Like in terms of the network, and that helps you with your asset inventory, your scoping about what kind of vulnerabilities we are going to be testing for, and things like that. Next is Nessus. This is a very kind of common tool for vulnerability scanning, and then I think it's one of the most comprehensive tools out there. So it's really great for kind of complex systems, and it really has an extensive database of vulnerabilities and configuration issues. So the various software components, how do I set it up properly, and what kind of vulnerabilities might be there, and kind of tells me what I have to do to protect it against. So it's really an in-depth scan across various environments, whether that's the cloud or on-prem. There's a lot of versatility in this tool, and the great thing too is it's SCAP compliant. So I mentioned before with the third-party and open source vulnerabilities that you might want to select tools that are SCAP compliant if you're targeting integration with third-party and open source vulnerabilities to try and manage all of that together. Selecting that tool is important. And then another SCAP compliant tool next is OpenVAS. So this is an open source vulnerability scanning tool. So it's more of a cost-effective solution. It's got a solid framework for scanning, managing all your vulnerabilities into one platform, and it's built on an updated database. So any new vulnerabilities come in, it's pretty great at integrating those new vulnerabilities or configuration issues, things like that. So it's a great place to start if you're trying to implement VAPT within your system. It's again, it's cost effective. So, and then I mentioned it's also SCAP compliant, which is also great. Now, the next one is more of for web application testing, Burp Suite, and it's great for ranging in kind of simple vulnerabilities to more complex security loopholes that you might find in kind of modern web applications, and then it also has a great kind of detailed reporting capability. So it's great for if you have web applications. So, ultimately it's important to select the right tool for the job. So, always great to do, kind of an inventory of all the possible tools that you might use. Important to think about SCAP compliance, because Again, as I mentioned before, it's a standard that's going to be coming. They're just trying to figure out in terms of the format and how to properly share all this security information. But it's coming, it's getting better, and I do think within the next 5 years, we're going to be required to have some sort of monitoring of third-party or open source vulnerabilities built within our system to be deemed secure with any certification or regulation. And ultimately, it'll help you align with industry standards and compliance checking. So that's great. That's it for now. We learned how to kind of the considerations that you need to take in when starting an assessment, and kind of some of the common tools that you might use. There obviously are a lot more. It's great to kind of check a few, maybe run through some tutorials, which we will do within this section. But hopefully that gave you an idea of what to consider to start an assessment. And now we're going to actually get into the asset inventory, which I think is one of the most important things as any security professional, if you're trying to secure a system or an organization, is okay, what am I actually trying to secure? What are the functions of every piece of this system? It's super important to create that list and then separate out the two so you can categorize vulnerabilities in terms of severity, how critical is that component to your system, things like that. And then I'll walk through an actual example of an asset inventory of what it might look like. So yeah, thanks, and we'll see you next time. Hello and welcome everybody to our walkthrough of an asset inventory. And it's one of my favorite things to actually do as a security professional because it really makes you confident about what you're actually going to be protecting. So at this point, you should be able to understand, what's really involved in an assessment and what are the things you can do to really prepare yourself and to make this successful. And then we've also walked through some of the scanning tools that are common in the industry, which we'll follow up later with, an actual tutorial using some of these tools. So, what is an asset inventory? It's really the first crucial step in your security journey for securing a system, and you can't think of it as just one list, right? It's more of a guide. It's this comprehensive catalog of your physical and digital assets. So hardware, software, applications, data, kind of everything that you need to know about a system to best protect it, right? It's really about defining the scope about what needs to be protected, and in that way you kind of understand the impact too, right? What a specific asset does can kind of tell you, okay, if this was compromised, what does that mean for my system? Whether it's leaking data or actually bringing down your system. So then you have to deal with availability. So it's really the main starting point to ensure that no component is forgotten, and then that's kind of where what your attackers are actually looking for are components or things that you might have missed in your assessment. So what an asset inventory really enables is a targeted assessment and efficient resource allocation. So making sure that you're not wasting time, spending too much time, missing things, and really starting off on the right foot. And really, it's about making informed risk management decisions. And so now we're actually going to walk through. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at an example asset inventory that I created. Here's a Google Sheet that I created. It can be anything you want. Doesn't necessarily have to be fancy, but it's got to be easily readable. I like Sheets because it's quite shareable and has the functions of Excel. So let's get into it. The first thing is you want to create an identity system. Obviously it has to be unique. So here we're calling it an asset ID. And this example that I've created is for a company XYZ corporation, and they're really trying to just create a cloud service. So you see here, we're using AWS, so I've included AWS in the identifier. You can really get flexible here, but it's got to be understandable by not just you, right? Because you might be sharing it, your role might shift, right? And somebody else takes it over. So want to make sure everything is smooth in the handover process and information sharing. So try to be descriptive as possible. I put AWS 001. I could even be more descriptive here if I wanted to. But remember, this is just an example, just to give you an idea or a flavor of what this could look like. The asset type, it's what. Yes, it's in the cloud, but what is it really? So here, we have an EC2 instance, an S3 bucket, and these are like components of your cloud solution, right? And so if it's, let's say an application that runs on Windows, your one of your asset components would be Windows, and then there's your actual application, things like that, right? The description here, you want to really understand its purpose. Why are you using it? It could be, a web server that's hosting the main website, right? And then location kind of helps pinpoint. All these are in the cloud, but you could even identify region. You could, especially with physical assets, where it's actually located. It's very important to kind of track all of those things. And then there's also kind of network segmentation that you could apply here, whatever you want, right, to help you understand what's going on with this asset. The owner field, that's very important. It's who's in charge of that, right? So if there's a problem or you're trying to implement a fix for something, who do you go to? Or yeah, things like that. If there's a compromise, who are you going to be working with to fix it? It's very important to track all that. One, it's important to know who to talk to, but also like it changes, right? So you got to make sure that this is constantly up to date. And that's another piece with this whole thing is you really need to make sure it's up to date, because if you let it slide, then it could cause a lot of confusion and wasted resource. The criticality here gets into it's not necessarily the vulnerability, right? It's not a severity level, but it's the critical, how critical is it to the functioning of your system? Generally here it's more about availability, right? If this component goes down, will everything go down? And you want to try and create high, medium, low in terms of the levels to understand are you in like complete code red situation, or okay, we'll put it on the ticket and fix it at a later time if it's really not impacting the system. And then I've also kind of included here service and environment. What Amazon service are you actually using? Is it a production environment, a deployment environment, development environment? It could be staging, beta. There's lots of options here. Configuration details is kind of important, right? These are related to your configuration settings. Or just the what it's composed of. Like here we have Ubuntu and auto scaling enabled. So everything you need to know about how that component is configured. And I think at this point, I can just kind of get into the details, because you kind of get into later on maybe customizations to this asset inventory. Like I like to include vulnerability scope, testing methods, and recovery mechanisms to just kind of keep it all in one place. These don't necessarily have to be there for an asset inventory, but it does help to kind of break it down on a per component basis, especially when you're thinking about what kind of scanning you're going to do and what's required. So I think we're going to walk through one of these rows. Let's pick the EC2 instance, for example. It's the primary web application server, so that means it's high criticality, right? It's going to be front facing, and then here just it's cloud. We're using Amazon's EC2 service. It's production, and the owner would be the DevOps team, right? Because they're going to be the ones that spin it up and use that resource, and really have full control over that. And then here, I've outlined some of the vulnerability categories that we talked about earlier. Unpatched software is going to be an issue. Configuration, that's going to be really important. You want to make sure your APIs are secure, and then if you're doing any encryption, make sure it's strong encryption. And then some of the testing methods that we could do. Here we can do vulnerability scans, and then you probably want to do maybe some manual penetration testing to really see if you can, gain control over that instance, and then constantly review your configuration, right? Especially if you're doing any updates, really make sure that you haven't misconfigured something to allow it access to certain data or whatever. And then I really like to put recovery mechanisms in my asset inventory, right? Because it's if it goes down, these are the things you're going to do, or at least these are the mechanisms you've put in place to allow recovery. So, I want to implement regular snapshots for my backups. I'm going to use an elastic block store for the data volumes, and then we can create kind of versions to really track, the evolution over time. And of course, I want to automate that, because backup processes are quite time consuming. And so how do we actually back up that? And then of course, something that's often ignored is actually test that restoration. Sure, you've implemented a restoration plan, but have you actually tested it? And that's something that should be done quite frequently, especially as ransomware attacks become more prominent. This becomes really important to quickly recover if everything goes down. Even if you, let's say, pay the ransom, get the key, you still have to recover, which are actually a lot of the costs in those types of attacks. And then some additional notes, right? Here I've already mentioned it's the front end for the main website. So it could be additional details like, for here, the S3 bucket, it's storing CSS files, image files, whatever. And then this one's important, which is your RDS database, which actually contains sensitive information. So that's kind of another thing really to work into this is what kind of data is stored and what components are actually storing it. So yeah, hopefully this gave you an idea of what an asset inventory looks like. They are quite customizable. You can find a lot of templates online. You can even use this one if you want to, but really, you want to make sure you understand your whole system because it serves as a blueprint for everything that you're going to be working with. What's in it, how everything is configured and working together, and as I mentioned before, it's the most necessary thing for a security professional, I think, because I don't think you could do your job without it. So. And next, we're actually going to get into how do we actually perform the assessment? What are the steps needed to actually do it? We've kind of done our best to prepare. What are we actually going to do to perform that assessment? Hey guys, it's finally time for our assessment. Last time we talked about the asset inventory and how to create a complete list of all the different assets, whether that's physical or software based, put it all into one place so that we can create this catalog of all of our physical or software assets. And so we really want to, continue being methodical and efficient throughout the whole process to make sure it's a success. And, I don't want to continue further unless I mention again, please be safe when scanning. Follow the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Make sure that you get signed approval before doing any of these tests because there are potential legal consequences. Now, to begin, we're going to cover the high-level steps and then get into the details after when we can combine it with physical examples to really understand what's going on and get some hands-on experience. We'll be covering a tutorial on the scanning tool later, interpreting the results, and then, how do we take that and create proper documentation. So any vulnerability assessment really starts with running your automated scans, right? You're going to schedule during off-peak hours. You don't want to interrupt any ongoing operations, and basically minimize the impact of your security tests. And depending on the complexity of your system or the high kind of criticality of a component, you might want to combine it with some manual testing. So get a little bit into penetration testing just to really make sure that you got all the vulnerabilities possible. An example could be like a financial web application. So, very, very important. And it's going to use maybe some custom authentication mechanisms for enhanced security, multi-factor authentication, CAPTCHA validation, maybe dynamic session management to make sure that, things close properly. There's a lot of things to manipulate there because it's so critical. You're going to get those really advanced penetration tests attacks on it. So that's kind of an example. I know it gets into a little bit more penetration testing, but this is kind of where the overlap happens and maybe the confusion about the two. But ultimately, you're kind of doing enough to identify the vulnerability, not necessarily exploit it completely and see how far you can get to the system, what data you can collect. You're not going that far yet, right? That's for penetration testing. And then we're of course going to analyze the results, right? We're going to get into classification. As I mentioned, that's one of the most difficult parts of this. Assessing the impact of a vulnerability, identifying it is one thing, understanding how it can impact your system is another. And a huge part of this too is you're going to identify false positives because you are going to get some. And how do you identify those versus the real ones? That's part of the analysis process. And then once you've done all that, you're able to create a prioritized list of vulnerabilities, and how we do that will be covered later. And also here, you're going to include kind of standards for reporting, right? You want to report in a proper way that everybody can understand, whether that's compliance checking, regulators looking in, making sure you're compliant, certification bodies, other developers, and even upper management to make sure that everybody understands. And so that's where you need to make sure that you have proper documentation. And then following that, which is part of the assessment, is actually creating your action plan. So, short-term, long-term remediation, really what comes after your assessment and what you're going to do to either fix them or create processes to make sure that you're creating this continuous improvement cycle. All right, so the action plan. You know, this starts off with actually creating a list of your vulnerabilities and then creating whether that's a short-term or a long-term remediation plan for that specific vulnerability, right? Because it could be, let's say, a huge vulnerability. You might not know how to fix it yet, but you want to have some sort of short-term fix that maybe minimizes the impact of that vulnerability, and then in the meantime implement the long-term plan to really fix that and get it working. So you're really outlining here what you think should be done and how you're going to do it. What teams you're working with, because a lot of these will involve working with the developers to actually issue the fix. Then you're going to be documenting all of your findings, right? So severity, impact, including the remediation plans, and a really important thing here is to create a standardized way of creating that document. So looking at different standards, even creating your own is very important. And I'm going to cover that after when we get into actually analyzing the results and taking that final step to complete your vulnerability assessment. And then once you've completed that document, you're going to share your findings, right? You got to think about method of sharing. How are you actually going to share it? Is it going to be a Google Doc? Is it going to be part of let's say your GitHub? There's a lot of ways to share that, and you need to think about who the audience is, because ultimately you need to get all the proper and appropriate stakeholders to see what you're creating. And then you also have to think about storage. How am I storing this document, version control, things like that. So once you've shared it, now you're actually going to start engaging with the proper shareholders, whether that's your development team or upper management, to present your findings. And it's going to be a discussion, right? You're not the one necessarily deciding the priority of things, right? Because it's based on resources, what maybe a developer thinks of the plan, they're going to have feedback. And so it's this kind of cyclical process to slowly get to the point where you have this prioritized list that everybody agrees with, and then how to implement it. And here it's important to actually get approval and sign off for whatever you're doing. It's a common theme that we're going to keep going through. But this really ultimately lands on creating this continuous improvement. So, this is your vulnerability management plan, how you're going to integrate it into your development lifecycle. This might even include awareness training, right, as part of the fix, whether that's a social engineering attack. These you need to train employees how to not click on links in your email, things like that. So really, it's all about process. Creating process automation such that you can minimize error as well as manual effort. And then even in this, you don't necessarily mention penetration tests within this document. This document's all about identifying the vulnerabilities, but you might include at the end kind of a test plan, right? I'm going to apply this tool to really try and exploit this vulnerability to understand it more, because you might not know all everything about a vulnerability until you actually get in there and test it fully. So and then so yeah, that's about it for today. I covered, the steps to actually implement the vulnerability assessment, some of the standards, action plan, and remember this is the what, and it's not the how. The penetration test is the how for a specific vulnerability. So next we're going to walk through some scanning tools and be able to analyze the results, and then create that final documentation to close off the section. Welcome to our walkthrough of Nessus, which is a vulnerability scanning tool that's very commonly used in the industry. Now, it's not necessarily a cheap tool, so I do recommend using OpenVAS as well, and compare the two in terms of whether you want to dedicate the resources to using this type of tool. But I think at least you should try the free versions and understand how it's used and how powerful it can be before making that decision. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do this for the course. And so yeah, today we're going to walk through this tool in an example using Metasploitable VM, which is an intentionally vulnerable OS that you can set up and running in a virtual machine environment and start running some scanning tools. And then you can also find some tutorials for how to hack various aspects within that, which is really fun and I recommend doing. But we can't treat everything in this course, so I'm just trying to give you the tools so that you can go out and try it. So the website I have up here is where you get Nessus Essentials, which is their free tool. It gives you effectively 16 scans that you can do on various IP addresses, and access to a lot of those tools that you can use in the professional version. You're going to have to first create an activation code and register for that. It's very easy. You'll get it in an email, and then once you do that, you'll end up getting to this page where you can actually download the version. So whether you're using Windows or whatever, you'll get the right version and start it up. As I mentioned, it's using a VM. This tutorial I have here is focused on VirtualBox. You can use it using VMware, that's fine. But I like using VirtualBox. And this will go through all the steps that you need to do to properly set it up. It's a great tool for kind of doing other penetration testing that you will do in this course and in your future endeavors. All right, so hopefully now you've logged in, and initially it'll prompt you with a host discovery. So you can go ahead and do that if you want, or cancel and go into this user interface. Whatever will work, but it's really set up to start quickly and start scanning. So you're going to do a host discovery, and you can quickly do a basic network scan if you want to. And if you know your IP address already of your Metasploitable VM, great. You can enter it right there, and it should do a basic network scan. But I wanted to first kind of go into what the host discovery is actually doing before we get into the network scan. So here is where I've done the scan. It's going to display all your previous scans, and so it's really easy to kind of open up previous scans, see what we did. So my first scan here, if I click at that first one, I go back to the host. Now it's a different IP address. This is actually the IP address of my Metasploitable VM. Or I click this one, and it's going to be my host machine. And then this is where it's going to display some vulnerabilities or basic information. This is just a host scan, so it's really not scanning anything. It's going to ping your host and see if it's alive and make sure that it can actually connect and run the scan. So it's a good thing to do first. And importantly, it doesn't take one of the IP addresses that you have, that 16 that you get with Essentials, to run all your scans. So that's why I like to do it first, just to make sure it's not going to kind of use up one of those off the bat. Now, so if I go into configure, this is how I actually adjust it for the different targets that I want to do. So here I've entered my host IP address. I can definitely schedule different ones at different times, which is great. If I wanted to scan like overnight or things like that, then I can go off peak and which is kind of essential. But you're going to be using Essentials, so you probably won't be necessarily doing that right now. It's just for testing purposes. And then it's interesting, you can set up notifications for, let's say a scan is done and notify, whatever stakeholders you want to do, like your security team or whatever. Now the discovery is kind of where you can get a little bit customized in terms of what you're actually doing. There are a lot of different types of ping methods that you could use and kind of how you're actually going to scan your endpoints. But yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail because you're really going to know the environment that you're trying to scan, and that's part of the the whole preparation for your assessment before you actually get to the tool is really understanding everything that you're going to be scanning and how you're going to scan it. And here, this is where you can actually specify maybe a specific range, which could be good if you don't want to scan absolutely every port. So you can kind of narrow down your scope a little bit. But it's also good to keep it default or even go beyond that, really get every single port that you really want to try. And these are the different types of scanners that you can use. And this one's kind of using UDP. So it's really up to you what you want to do, or really up to what you're actually trying to scan. And this gets into the output. So what does your report actually look like? And then some advanced settings for addressing timeout. So really trying to tune your scan for optimal speed. Again, as a basic test right now, you don't need to get into that. But if you're scheduling a lot of these tests, then you're going to want to optimize them for resource consumption, time, things like that, to make sure you're not impacting your system. Again, remember the CIA triad. Part of that is ensuring availability of the systems that you're testing. Now that we've kind of understood what host discovery is, we can actually go ahead and do a new scan. So you can see here you have a lot of different types of scans ranging from ransomware attacks, web applications up here, or your basic network scan. And that's the basic network scan is the thing that you're going to do initially when you first load this in. So here you're going to specify a name for it, and again, it's the target. So for your VM Metasploitable, you want to specify that specific target. I've already done a scan for the Metasploitable VM, and we can kind of walk through a little bit of the results here. So I've named it Basic 1, and the vulnerabilities here are laid out, right? And so we'll see in the next video what that documentation looks like. But Nessus really separates them by critical, high, medium, and low, and then you might get some mixed where a specific vulnerability might be high or medium depending on how it was used, right? So you get this, and some even information regarding that specific component. And because Metasploitable is set up, there are going to be a lot of vulnerabilities that you can, go into and look at. So if you want to select one of these vulnerabilities, you can actually start gaining more information about it. So let's pick a particularly bad one, SSL, and great. There's a random number generator weakness, so your cryptography won't be as secure as it should be, and your SSH could be, potentially hackable. So it'll describe the description of your specific vulnerability as well as the solution. Here on the right is the plugin details as well as some of the key drivers. So, kind of the background surrounding that vulnerability, risk information about it. And what I really want to get to is the bottom where it's actually going to reference specific information about that vulnerability. So using a standard CVE, that's great. We can click on that and look at the specific CVE associated with that vulnerability. And here it's going to outline, okay, the specific OpenSSL version, it's going to suffer it from this weakness. And so really that tells you what SSL version to upgrade to, and all the references associated with that. So you can go as deep as you want, but a simple fix is just to upgrade your OpenSSL version. Okay, so let's go back to our scanning tool. So great, I've done a scan. Now I actually want to get to the reporting stage. So what's great about Nessus is you can quickly create these reports that outline all of your vulnerabilities in a pretty nice way. So you generate the report, which I've already done, and we'll go over to this tab. This creates effectively HTML page where it's going to summarize all of your vulnerabilities for you, and the different criticalities and some of the information that you gain. So you're going to have to go through each one by one and really understand the impact to your system. It saves a lot of time, but you really are going to have to understand the results that are here. And I also recommend running new scans. So going back to the tool, we can select a new scan. You can do web application testing. So the OWASP example I used in the previous, try and run your own scans. Now, don't run it necessarily on the website itself. There is an ability to download it and run it locally on your system, but you can run web application tests to really understand the capabilities of the scanning tool. So thanks. Hopefully that helps. Next, we're going to walk through how we actually take that and put it into documentation. Thanks. Bye. So hopefully this helped you understand a little bit about Nessus. There are other tutorials online for more specific things, but I wanted to give you a quick introduction to a really valuable tool. I recommend going through it, walking through some specific vulnerabilities to really understand how they go from the scanning stage to the reporting stage, and even the background information, right? These vulnerabilities that are in this tool were found by other teams and reported, and then Tenable created a plugin to basically test that tool. Welcome to our discussion on the vulnerability assessment documentation. So, by now we've learned some hands-on experience with the Nessus scanning tool, and a lot of that can be extended to other tools like OpenVAS if you want to use an open source one, which I do recommend. But now you've had that experience, and we've also looked at analyzing those results. So taking those results and really trying to understand them, classify vulnerabilities, identify false positives, and really put together this vulnerability map of our system. But now that leads us into documentation, and I always like to talk about the 3 C's. We got clarity, consistency, and comprehensiveness. You really need to easily convey your results to a wide audience, right? Whether that's upper level management that might not understand really a lot of what you're trying to describe, or developers that are quite technical but still might not understand the security space. So you really got to make sure everything's clear and concise. And again, management buy-in, you need it to actually do what you're trying to do. But I think it's even more important for your actual security posture, because I think if you have poor documentation, that can lead to vulnerabilities because somebody might, like a stakeholder in charge of let's say a pipeline, uh, doesn't understand the specific vulnerability because it wasn't conveyed clearly or wasn't even written down, right? So you got to make sure you document everything and give as much detail as possible so that anybody can understand it. And then, of course, to think about too, you might not be in that role forever, or a company's making a transition, and so that that assessment that you do needs to, go through a smooth transition period where somebody else might be the owner of this document. And that's also important. And if that's not handled correctly, that's how components get lost in terms of what vulnerabilities might be there, and hackers can exploit that. So, first and foremost, consistency is key. You really need to develop a standard template for your documentation and make it consistent all the way through. So, it's really good to kind of look at other ones, get your feel for what kind of ways you like to describe information, and check out some standards. One that's really great, and I recommend everybody reading, especially in this course, is the NIST SP 800-115, where it's really a technical guide for security testing and assessments, and so you can really get an idea of the standards of how to report a vulnerability. But you also need to consider, if you're targeting any certifications, like let's say ISO 27001, we'll have specific standards for how you report all of this information when you go through certification, and when you're actually certified, you need to have documents available. And then, to find your own standard, right? This is an opportunity for you to describe something in a way to your choosing. What information that you like to put in there, and how you like to organize it. But again, consistency is key. So make sure you maintain that all the way through documentations and versions and everything like that. So the goal is really to unify language and your format. So that allows you to create consistent communication with anybody involved. You need to make sure that everybody has buy-in to what you're trying to do. You're going to be crossing security teams, dev teams, and management. So, what really goes into a report? You can start with a vulnerability description, describe the actual impact of a specific vulnerability, right? So you're going to be taking information from your asset inventory and can kind of place it in here. And often these are described in as tables, which I'll show you an example after this video. But you're trying to describe what that vulnerability is, the impact of it, and then you can get into severity levels, like how does it actually impact your system. So you're trying to really classify this vulnerability, and there are different ways to do that. You can use a number scheme, low, medium, high. There are standards like CFSS for that. They're not necessarily perfect, but that's kind of where the standards are going for that. So it's good to get an idea of that, and especially if you use SCAP compliant tooling that might report things in like CFSS. So really important to understand that, and use a system that works for you. It kind of depends on the complexity, right? Just you need to be able to prioritize vulnerabilities in a way that everybody understands. That's basically the main goal for that. And then there's reproduction steps. So how to actually demonstrate the vulnerability, right? How to reproduce that vulnerability. So that might include scripts, URLs, specific inputs. We talked about a code injection attack. What is the script or the code that you use to actually do that? And it's really crucial for the remediation steps, where you might be handing it off to a development team, and you really want them to understand the vulnerability first before they start trying to fix it, because then you're not really sure if it's fixed or not, right? So it's kind of treating it like a software bug, right? You have a problem and you want to reproduce it, and that's how you understand the vulnerability in and of itself and how to fix it. Also included is evidence. So that could be screenshots, logs. Ultimately, you just want visual proof, right, that there is indeed a vulnerability there. And then this can include results from your scan, whatever you think that helps show that vulnerability does indeed exist, right? And then kind of want to end it with your remediation guidance, which we mentioned a lot. Be specific, and then makes it actionable, right? You need to describe what the fix is, and then show how to actually fix it, and be as detailed as possible. Imagine here you're a coder trying to implement code. You want comments on every line, really, to make sure that somebody can take it and actually issue the fix. And of course, you might be working with development teams to actually do this. But really, you want to just create this template for your documentation. You're going to be reusing it. As I mentioned before, it's a cyclical process. You're going to be constantly doing this, so you really want to make sure you have that template to quickly, reproduce these documents as quickly as possible. So now I'm just going to show you a quick example template that I found online, and that just kind of give you an idea. We don't have to go through the whole thing, but I just wanted you to give like a real world example of what might look like. The example that I found was created by PurpleSec. So you can easily find it, sample vulnerability assessment report, purplesec.pdf. So it's an easily accessible PDF document. There are quite a few more that you can find, but I thought this was a good one because it goes into a fair amount of detail, as an example. And you can see, table of contents, executive summary, scan results, our findings, and it's actually a pretty well put together document. And the risk assessment here is talking about the different types of vulnerabilities that were found. And you can see that they used, critical, high, medium, or low severity. So they didn't necessarily follow the CFSS, but they created their different buckets to really get across to the different teams of, okay, what do we really need to fix first, and then lower on. So there's actually a fair amount of, critical vulnerabilities that were found here, and so they've focused on plugins and created a little bit of a description, as well as the solution, right? And you will find out that a lot of solutions are fixed with patching software, because you're going to use a ton of third-party or open source components, and you're kind of relying on the patches, right? And sometimes you're kind of limited. Maybe you're using Windows 2003 that you can't upgrade because you're running on an old system. So that gets into maybe short term and medium term, because you don't want to invest necessarily at the beginning to just completely change all of your hardware and operating systems. But this document should kind of explain that. And something important to point out here is the count. So it's effectively the amount of instances this vulnerability came up, and you've seen that in our with our scanning tools. But basically, you're trying to categorize the specific vulnerability, and so it's like it comes up a lot. So it kind of that might be a factor of why it's super critical, or it's just such a critical piece that you need to upgrade, even if it was only found once. And then they've separated in the different high, medium, low, and then they're following up with like kind of a summary of their recommendations, like action to take, upgrade Firefox, Acrobat, and other things. So and then another thing important here is the number of hosts, right? That tells you how many components are actually hosting this vulnerable software. And that's about it. We covered, effectively how to write a successful document, what information to include, and then I showed you an example. And that's about it for section 2. So really looking forward to wrapping this up and getting into penetration testing, which is how to actually exploit the vulnerabilities that we found in this section. So thanks. So that wraps up our section 2 of the course, focused on vulnerability assessment. We learned what to do to better prepare to make a successful assessment. One of them being creating this really nice asset inventory to track all of the components that might belong to our system, or even the greater organization, whether that's physical hardware or even software components. And we walk through an example that I'm showing here of a software as a service. So a cloud service and all of the different components like EC2 instance, S3 buckets, everything that you need to really track everything that's going on in your system. And then how they're connected. So how they're configured, what are the criticalities, the severity level if that specific component is compromised, even looking at vulnerability scope, what things we actually have to worry about, testing methods, and then, of course, the recovery mechanism. What you're doing for that component, if it goes down, how do you actually recover from it? And then we moved on to do an overview of the tools, and one of them being Nessus. So I walked through a specific example using Metasploitable VM, and we scanned it. Did a basic network scan, and it found some vulnerabilities because that's what it's designed to show. And then we looked at a specific vulnerability and what we can actually go through in terms of information that we can gather. And then finally taking that and creating this final report to one, show management like what you actually plan to do, so you can actually work with them to allocate resources to fixing certain vulnerabilities, but as well as this opportunity to show, okay, what's the solution, what's the desired remedy for that specific vulnerability, and create this prioritized list that you're going to tackle over the next year. And then that's about it. Next, we're actually going to get into penetration testing. So really excited to actually show some of the tools that we can use, some techniques that we can better understand how we can exploit these specific vulnerabilities that we might find. So thanks. See you in